So in my last video, I went over 5 of the top things I would like to see in Borderlands 4, but that video was more focused on things that have a high chance of being in Borderlands 4. Things like having pearlescent weapons or a lot of things that have been in previous Borderlands games. But in this video, I want to go over 5 things I would like to see in Borderlands 4, but these are things that have a much lower chance of being in Borderlands 4 and are generally just much bigger, more complex systems. And at number 5, we have a boss rush mode, and this is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. You would start the mode, you go face a random boss, then you say take a portal to go face another boss, and it could just be completely randomized bosses that take you potentially to every boss throughout the game. Now we actually have a boss rush mode from a previous game to look at from Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. There was a boss rush mode added into it later in its lifespan. I had stopped playing the game before this was added in, actually right before this was added in, but the boss rush in Wonderlands worked in a very similar way to what I would imagine with a system like this. You would start this mode, you would go in, you would face a boss, then you would get to choose between a handful of buffs in a similar way to a lot of the other endgame content from Wonderlands. Then you take a portal and you go face another boss. And in my opinion, it should be randomized and just take you to potentially every boss throughout the game, whether it be a raid boss or whether it be the end boss of the main story, or whether it be the first boss of the main story, or any boss you could possibly fight in the game could be in this mode. And I do think that having the roguelike mechanic where you choose a buff or some type of augment at the end of every boss could be a really cool addition to it, because I do also think that every new boss you get to should be more difficult than the last. It shouldn't just be a cycle of going through and defeating every boss at their normal difficulty. It should get harder and harder with every boss you get through, and then maybe depending on how many bosses you defeat in that run, maybe you can get a bunch of extra loot at the end. You would obviously still be getting loot from every boss, because that's one of the best things about Borderlands, killing a boss, having all the loot spew out, but having a bunch of loot at the end also, depending on how far you get, could be a really cool added mechanic to make a boss rush mode with increasing difficulty super exciting. Or another thing that could also be really cool is instead of having a bunch of additional loot at the end, maybe depending on how many bosses you defeat in that run, you get a currency specific to this mode, and then maybe you can go spend that currency at a vendor to allow you to more target farm specific items from the bosses. Like let's say you're going through and farming these bosses and you're looking for a very specific item from one of them. Maybe there's a vendor you can go to spend this currency to build up to getting that item you want. But if you go that route, I think you should have to do a lot of boss farming and a lot of boss rush farming to be able to get enough currency to buy a single item, because you don't want to just get a ton of currency super quickly to then just go buy all the items you want. You would want this to be a pretty long process and kind of a fail safe if you don't end up getting the item you want after a ton of farming. You could also add more random elements into this. Like imagine you go into a boss room and it's usually just a one boss, but imagine there's 2 of the same boss, or imagine there's another boss also in that room. So they could add a ton of different really cool elements that start to build up as you go through this mode and as the difficulty keeps ramping. And at number 4, we have a full roguelike mode. Now I did just mention that there could be some amount of roguelike elements in the boss rush mode, but I think having just a full roguelike mode would be incredibly interesting. Now I know Tiny Tina's Wonderlands also had the Chaos Chambers as its main endgame content, but I want something that's substantially more randomized with a lot more elements and allow you to go to basically everywhere in the game and face any enemies. I'm thinking more of adding in roguelike elements to ARPG map style system. So you could start this roguelike mode and the first level you go into could be pretty much anywhere in the entirety of the game, maybe kind of sectioned off, and then you say fight a bunch of enemies or do some objective or fight a boss, and once you defeat that, you then get to choose between a bunch of different buffs or different augments to the rest of the run, kind of like the Chaos Chambers when it comes to choosing buffs, but I would also want a lot more buffs. If you go to something like Risk of Rain 2, you get to constantly get a ton of different power-ups, and that's what I would like in a roguelike mode a lot more. Just have a ton of crazy buffs, have different rarities of buffs, so it's not just like health increases or damage increases, actual like different procs or cool things. Maybe you could get a legendary buff where you could float around super quickly or something, or maybe you could get a buff that makes your actual action skill have a really reduced cooldown, or maybe you could get a buff where your action skill has a really long cooldown, lasts a lot longer, or does a lot more damage, or maybe you could get a different buff that anytime you shoot a weapon, it has a chance to like shoot out some additional rockets or something. There are so many cool different buffs you could add in a mode like this. And my overarching idea is that every level you get past, it keeps increasing the difficulty, kind of in a similar way I would like with the boss rush mode. But this mode could also just take you to any part of the game. It could take you to any boss, any mini boss, any area with any randomized enemies within it, with any objectives you could also find throughout the game. Basically have like a full randomizer within this roguelike mode. Now, if you want to get really crazy with it, you could have a more experimental mode where you start with all white gear. And as you go throughout the mode, as you kill enemies, complete objectives, complete levels, within all of those buffs you're getting, you can also choose to get different pieces of gear to upgrade your gear, get different weapons, get higher rarity items, to where it is a full roguelike mode. Because if you go to most roguelike games, you're starting from 0 at the start of every run. And at number 3, we have crafting systems. Now, I went over this a little bit in a previous video, but this version would be a lot more expansive. And in the Borderlands franchise, we've had some item crafting systems. In the pre-sequel, you could grind weapons together to form a new weapon. In Borderlands 3, they added the ability to change anointments later down the road. And then in Wonderlands, you could also change enchantments. But this system I'm talking about would be much more expansive, and it wouldn't be about crafting new items. It would be about farming up items out of the game and then augmenting them with some type of other resources or other items. This is obviously very inspired by ARPGs like Diablo, and Borderlands as a franchise is also pretty heavily inspired by Diablo, so it makes sense to take some learnings from that subgenre as well. And there's a handful of different things they could do with this. The first one being kind of simple, where let's say you get a weapon from a boss and it has a bunch of the parts you want, but one of the parts is not the one you want. Let's say that part would give you one additional projectile in every shot. But let's say there's a crafting system in the game where you can take it to a certain vendor or like a crafting bench and actually change out the weapon part of that role. But that would obviously be really expensive, especially since it's a legendary weapon. The higher rarity, the more items you need to change apart. So maybe it just takes some specific resources you get from farming throughout the game, or maybe you need to find another weapon with that part, and then you say salvage it or something, and then you get that part and you can change it out for that weapon. There's a bunch of different ways they could do it, but having some way to augment the items you get as drops could be super interesting. They could also even add in whole new effects that you could add on items after you get them. Like if you go to Diablo or Path of Exile or any other Diablo-like ARPG, a lot of them have ways to augment gear and add on new effects after you've gotten them. So let's say you get this really cool legendary you like from a boss, and then let's say you could add some other effect on top of that to augment it in some way. Or you could even maybe have the ability to farm up different resources to change the elemental damage on the weapon. Or maybe you could even farm up some parts to change how a weapon works. Like the Borderlands franchise has a ton of crazy unique weapons that fire in really different ways. Let's say you have a weapon that fires a spray of bullets in a horizontal line. Maybe you could go to the crafting bench and change it so now it's a horizontal line or something crazy like that. There's so many different things they could do to just make the gear and make augmenting the gear much more interesting. And all of this potential crafting would just play into creating cooler and more interesting builds, which in my opinion is the biggest draw of Borderlands as a franchise. Now at number 2, we have a customizable area, or essentially player housing. Now we had something like this in Borderlands 3. On Sanctuary, you had your room that you could go customize and put different signs or boss heads on, and you could also display different weapons up in the room. That was a very small version of what I want in this. And you could just have like, you get your own house or you get your own shack or something that you can customize and put things on the wall. Or maybe in one of the main towns of the game, you could have your own room or something that you could customize. But what I would really want is having a full town, or the main town or settlement, or basically Borderlands 4's Sanctuary, to be fully customizable. Like imagine just going into the town and you can customize the layout, you can customize decorations, you could change where the different NPCs or vendors actually are. If you want to take it even further, you could also add some amount of progression into the town itself. So let's say you're out killing bosses and you get like a schematic that you learn that allows you to add something to your town. Like maybe you get a really rare legendary schematic from a boss that allows you to create this different building or kiosk that brings in some rare vendor that you can buy rare drops from, but they have a really limited item selection or any number of different things. You could even tie this back into questing or the story of the game, because imagine if they had some type of system like this and you go farm up this boss, maybe they drop some schematic where you go create this thing at your town and it brings in a new NPC that gives you a new really cool quest that you weren't able to get before. So there's a ton of stuff you could do with a customizable system like this, and this is the one out of this entire list that I think has the lowest chance of happening, just because this is such an expansive system. But this could be something that could just be so cool in the Borderlands franchise. You could also just have a bunch of really wacky stuff like putting NPCs in wacky areas and it unlocks different voice lines, or any number of different things could just be super interesting. And then finally, at number 1, we have an infinitely scaling tower type system. And what I mean by tower is basically a system where you go into and it sends you to, say, a different level, or maybe even a similar level or arena where you face a bunch of enemies or a boss. And once you defeat that, you go to the next level of the tower. And the tower is infinitely scaling, and every level you go up, it gets more and more difficult. And the main thing I think this would allow for is to test your builds in just more and more difficult content. At some point, you're not going to be able to go any higher, but that's actually a really good design element because it allows the developers to give you a bunch of rewards to make the content super difficult, but not make anybody feel like they have to be able to do it. Because it's infinite, you can never complete it. So it's just about taking whatever build you're trying to create and seeing how far you can get with that build. It's a really good way to compare the power of builds. It could also just be super interesting and cool content. It gets more and more difficult, so you always have a new challenge to go and try to face. They could also make this tower have just super high mob density that's always super fun. It could also tie in looting into it. Like my idea would be every floor you increase your loot rarity with each floor. The first floors you start at have a much lower rarity than the rest of the game. So this would incentivize you to get to some of the higher levels and not just do the starter levels. So you would want to keep getting higher and higher levels to get higher loot rarity, not more loot. That's a big distinction, just higher loot rarity. So you don't have to just search through absurd amounts of gear. So a infinitely scaling tower like this would allow you to test your builds and just have some really fun and challenging content to always go partake in. But that's 5 of these systems I would like to see in a Borderlands game if I was able to add anything to a Borderlands game, because a lot of these I don't think have a very high chance of being in Borderlands 4 or even a future Borderlands game. But if I had my wish and I could add anything to Borderlands 4, these are a lot of the systems I would add. I think these would be super interesting and just add a ton of replayability to the end game of a Borderlands game. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.